Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today, and actually as I introduced the show, I realized that's actually what we're going to be talking about a little today, is going to be talking a little bit about what is the difference or what is similar about alternate history versus we often use the term counterfactuals. So as you know, we've subtitled A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. But some might argue that sometimes that our approach blurs the line between something what is sometimes referred to as counterfactual history and alternate or alternative history. So I thought it would be a good idea just to sort of lay that out there. In some ways, I think it's sort of a Tweedledee, Tweedledum kind of discussion, 6 one, half a dozen the other type of thing. It really doesn't make much difference, or the fact that we blur the lines and sort of do both here on the podcast, I believe, is just the fact that they are so closely related that to try to distinguish them, I think, is sometimes a little bit of a parlor exercise versus something that actually exists. But there are those who would hold to the fact that alternate history and counterfactual history are not the same thing. So today on the podcast, we're going to just take a few minutes just to talk about what is the difference between counterfactuals and alternate history, and trying to understand if there really is a difference of substance that needs to be considered, or whether it's just a difference of semantics. So before we get started, we're going to take a small break here today, hear about some of the folks that help make the podcast possible, and then we'll be back to pick up the subject of what are the differences and similarities between counterfactual history and alternate history. We'll be right back.
Would groceries delivered to you in as fast as 1 hour save you a trip to the store? Instacart makes that possible thanks to personal shoppers in your area who hand-select items based on your preferences from the stores you love. And shopping multiple stores is possible on a single order. Instacart picks the freshest produce and even keeps your eggs safe, all while finding everything you usually buy, providing smart suggestions for new items, and even highlighting deals to help you save money. And now you get free delivery on your first order over $35. Let Instacart know we sent you and help support our show by following the link in the show notes. Instacart. Groceries delivered in as fast as 1 hour.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast, or as we're going to be discussing today, maybe it's better described as a podcast that focuses on counterfactuals, as we sort of do an inside look into understanding how those two terms are sometimes used interchangeably, but how there are a number who take exception, who think that they are very different things, and just understanding better what is the difference or what is the similarities that exist between alternate history and counterfactuals. So as a starting point, perhaps we should just use some definitions and then we can begin to work off of that. So actually just going to use what is here in Google. If you look up counterfactual history, I'll put this particular Google entry in the notes for the show, where counterfactual history is sometimes referred to as virtual history. And it's a form of historiography, and we'll come back and talk about with our historiography. We'll talk about what that means, where it attempts to answer what-if questions, and those what-if questions are known as counterfactuals. It is basically saying it's the idea that at its very root is the idea of conjecturing on what did not happen or what might have happened if something didn't happen. So if something did happen, it's conjecturing on what would have happened if that had not had happened. It's negating the reality. Or in the case of a negative reality, something that did not happen, the negation obviously comes by the event actually happening. And so the counterfactual, as opposed to alternate history, we'll define that a little bit more later along here. The counterfactual does tend to focus more on the particular event or the particular thing around which the what if it didn't happen or if it did happen, happened. So when we think about A Fork in Time, we often talk about the historical what ifs. The what if that we're changing to the what if not, or if it was not, to the what if it did happen, is actually more specifically referred to as a counterfactual. And for me, the primary difference in the focus between counterfactuals and what we will define later as alternate history is the purpose that they're explored. Again, I mentioned here that it's a form of a historiography. It's basically a form of approach that historians can use, the counterfactual is, and normally it's used for the purpose of understanding the significance or the importance of the actual historical event. So often on a podcast episode, you will hear Alexis and I talk about, before we explore the historical what if, let's talk about the what did. And so in that sense, it may be a true thing to say that here on A Fork in Time, we actually do spend some amount of time in a little bit more of the world of counterfactuals versus alternate history, in the sense of the purpose of the counterfactual is to be a tool for the historian to understand the significance of the real historical timeline. So, for example, there was an assassination plot in July of 1944 that was led by a number of high-ranking German officials and German military leaders, where they attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler. This is after the war has certainly reached the point after the Allied invasion at Normandy and D-Day into Europe. And it's very clear that eventually Germany is going to lose the war. And so they are looking to remove Hitler from power for a number of reasons, but also to be in a position where they can sue from a stronger position for the peace. Hitler survives that assassination attempt. And so the history that we know is a history that Hitler survives, the bomb survives the plot that was there. A movie here about a decade ago starring Tom Cruise, Valkyrie, was made regarding this particular event. And so the actual real historical event is there was an assassination attempt on Hitler's life via bombing, and it failed. Hitler survives, and so the history that we have, the real timeline, has a surviving history. The counterfactual that can be posed by historians is what would have happened if that plot had succeeded and Hitler had in fact been assassinated and had died and was removed from power. In looking at that point, the historian then will look to see what would have happened, particularly after that, who might have risen to power, what might things have been like with Himmler or Goebbels or Speer, Bormann or Göring, or whoever might have taken control of the situation at that time. Again, it's in July of 1944. What would have happened, historians will look to see what would have happened if Hitler had been removed. The purpose, though, of doing that exercise is to understand, at least from the historian's point of view, is how much influence the fact that it did not have, or did not happen, have on the actual course of history. So again, the focus, interestingly, of the counterfactual approach is really to use the historical what if to focus more, to understand more about the historical what did. Because, again, as we've talked so often on episodes about the podcast, you can understand the significance of an event very often by seeing what the alternative might have been. It draws sharp relief against the original event in terms of understanding its impact, its significance, or in some cases, what will actually be led by counterfactual is how the event had little or no impact whatsoever. The analogy that I would use, sort of bringing it to a modern standpoint, I think back to September 11th of 2001, the events that happened in the United States, the attacks on the World Trade Centers in New York and the targets in Washington. We've had episodes on those here on the podcast. On that particular day, I know very much about where I was and what I did. So I have a very enhanced memory of the actions of Don on September 11th, 2001, because I remember where I was because of events that happened several thousand miles away and that were impactful. However, what I did or did not do, what Don did or did not do on that day, certainly did not have any impact whatsoever on the actual main historical events of that day, which were the events of 9/11. And so, if you were going back and looking at a counterfactual, and you changed perhaps where I was when I first heard the news, or the fact maybe if I had stayed home from, or been planning to stay home from work ill that day instead of being headed towards the office after the first attack, and knowing where I was when when the first structure fell, that would not have changed the significant outcome of history, I believe, in any way, shape, form, or fashion. In other words, what Don did or did not do on September 11th, 2001, as a counterfactual has very little historical import. So if you go back and look at those events, again, which I can remember very well because they're laid against the backdrop that I experienced that day. That's why I can remember what I did on that day versus probably not remembering near as much about what happened on September 10th, the day before, just 24 hours before at the exact same time, is you can go back and historians will look at that and say from a counterfactual standpoint, if we change by 15 minutes the time that Don left the house to head to the office that day, that would have virtually had no impact on history. That's a counterfactual that is of no impact. However, we've talked about a number of times, in fact, we talked about it on the podcast where we talked about the 33 minutes. If you change 15 or 30 minutes of activity among some of the major actors that day, you can have a tremendous impact on the historical events of that day. And then flowing from that, you get into what would have happened if the events had not occurred, if the attacks had been thwarted, if there had only been one of the planes that hit the World Trade Center towers, all the things that can flow off of that. So again, the purpose of today's podcast is to draw the distinctions between counterfactuals and alternate history, and I think that's a good example. A counterfactual could look at what would have happened with one of the hijackers that day and that would have been different, that may have had a tremendous difference, may have had a tremendous change on the outcome of history. Or you can look at the events of Don for that day and have virtually no impact whatsoever on any history of substance other than my own personal history that day. So simply, that's a counterfactual exercise. What that says is Don was not in a position that day to have significant impact, and negating his actions would not have done anything significant, whereas for somebody else, their actions, their existence, their activities had a tremendous impact. So again, it's looking at the actual historical what did by looking at what if would have been to judge the what did. Now, where this crosses over is if you start looking at what the situation might have been that I think now falls more into what is traditionally called alternate history, and looking at, because of that counterfactual, what would have happened moving forward. So again, using the 9/11 example, we'll go back and change the outcome so that the plot was somehow thwarted in its entirety. There probably are hundreds of different incidents in the chain of events that led up to that where law enforcement officials may have put clues together, or again, there may have been a situation where the hijackers were detected in their planes because they were all fogged in, and they discovered that they had the knives, the box cutters on them, that type of thing. And so you might be able to easily construct through a very small chain of counterfactuals, the very small change of a couple of what-if events, you might be able to change and have the entire events of 9/11 as we know them not happening. Now, if you project forward what that means differently and you start looking at what an alternative history might have looked like because of that change of the counterfactual, now you can branch off into a number of different directions. For example, we actually talked that day about on the episode that Alexis and I did, talking about what the difference would have been if one of the planes had actually struck the White House and how that might have changed the reaction of American political leadership and military leadership and all kinds of other things in the immediate aftermath of the events of 9/11 and subsequent on down the road for the events that happened over several years. As you begin to follow out the branches that come from that single counterfactual, now you have to, by definition, now move more into the speculative. You haven't just negated one fact or one small set of facts as you do in the counterfactual, but now you have negated that, which leads you to now have to decide what might have happened from among a series of choices, and based upon that series of choices, what might have happened or not have happened. And as you can see, the ripple effects from that now in the genre of what I would call alternate history are far different. And so while both counterfactual history and alternate history both have an element of speculation to them, at least in my way of understanding or my way of thinking about, the biggest difference between the two is how far that speculation goes and how much license that you're willing to give it. Certainly, alternate history falls more in the area of fiction. We've talked before about the number of and the proliferation of writers of alternate history that have existed. and currently do exist. It's a very popular realm of science fiction, but it's the idea that changing that one event, again, what we refer to as the fork here on the podcast, then looking at the flow of that moving forward, by definition, always involves a great amount of speculation. Whereas the counterfactual history approach is a little bit more academic in its approach, and certainly while it has speculation involved, it wants to look at what is the most probable of the speculative outcomes, whereas an alternative fiction writer, someone who writes alternative historical fiction, may just look at any of the most plausible alternative timelines. In fact, he may look at, or she may look at the one that is actually the most entertaining or the most fiction worthy, if you will, not even the one that is the most probable. While possible, not even the most probable. So I think it is true to say that one of the differences between counterfactual history, or the focus on counterfactuals, versus alternate history sort of is, what is the purpose? Counterfactual being more, I think, falling in the academic realm, whereas certainly alternate history falls more in the realm of fiction and entertainment, and there's a whole genre there. Now, having said that, I think there's a lot of crossover between the two concepts going back and forth. I think there are a number of things that fall in the area of those that have been things that have been penned by alternate history writers in that genre, who very much looking towards what was the most probable scenario, what was the most likely outcome. So it's much more of a historical bend to the approach. And then there are some who really, once they remove the event, negate the event, and the idea of the counterfactual, or cause something to happen that did not happen, in terms of making a positive counterfactual. In other words, once they have the license for the fork to go down a different path, then once they've got the fork, they just run with it. It's now that they've removed whatever existed before, they've created something new that did not exist before. Now they have the license to move forward with that, and they're not as concerned about exploring the most likely outcomes, but you say might be looking at exploring the most entertaining outcomes. I know for me, as a connoisseur of alternate history, I probably tend to lean towards liking those writers who have a little bit more basis in fact. I think you probably see that expressed here on the show, in terms of us when we talk things through, looking at what are the more likely things to have happened. And there we'll actually draw from a number of parallel things. For example, we may say, how is this like something else? Or how is it unlike something else? I know in a number of times that we've explored the alternative areas of English history, particularly on those episodes that Alexis has been involved, we will draw some parallel to maybe something that's going on in France, or something that has happened before or happens after in English history, to speculate on what the historical what-if would be. In other words, it's not just a wild historical what-if, it's a historical what-if that mimics or looks at other situations that were similar, to say, if that would have happened here, and because this did happen there, connecting those two things together, that's much more probable or plausible in terms of laying it out as being an alternative speculation as to an alternative history. So for me, again, as a consumer of alternate history, I probably tend to fall more liking the types of things that have more of a basis in fact, or at least a basis in not just fictional conjecture. Although sometimes it can be interesting to think about what fictional conjecture would look like. For me, one of the examples of that, actually on the podcast, that I would point back to, is the episode that we had, which actually had a guest host, where we talked about what would have happened if by accident, and again we're assuming by accident, that the famous Annie Oakley had accidentally shot the German Kaiser in the late 19th century. And then we talked about, speculated on how things might have been different without a Kaiser Wilhelm II leading Germany. But the counterfactual there is a fairly minor counterfactual, and moving down the alternate historical path, we spent a great deal of that episode talking about things that were based upon the Kaiser's character, the temperament of others who may have taken office or had been in positions of power, the relationship that existed with a Bismarck that had been removed from influence that might have been brought back into influence. All the things that we speculated on there, which certainly fall within the area of alternate history, were heavily based upon much more of what I think would be the probable versus the possible. If we were historians looking at that event, what we'd actually be looking at is how important was Kaiser Wilhelm as an individual towards the immediate things that happened after that in terms of near-term history, after that particular event in time, that fork in time, and then moving forward. Eventually, he is, in the real timeline, he remains the Kaiser of Germany into World War One. And so when we're looking at how things would have been different if we're taking a counterfactual approach, that has a limited time scope of where it has value, because he is the Kaiser for several decades moving on from there. So the counterfactual approach would probably look a little bit more, focus a little bit more on the near-term consequences of the historical what-if and less on the speculative longer term. Where, at least for me, in my understanding of the difference between how to think about counterfactuals versus alternate history, is that alternate history is much more willing to extend forward over time and, again, look at the various ripples and changes that could have happened as a result. And in fact, a helpful way for me to think about that, we talked a little bit about here a few episodes back, the idea that you often see expressed in the comic genre of the multiverse. Although this comes from the idea of quantum theory or quantum physics, or some thought that exists there, that there are many worlds. And what's difference between the many worlds that are moving along are just slight variations that happen between, and they sort of branch off or split into an infinite series of many parallel worlds, parallel realities that basically just break out all of the particular decisions that are different between World A, World B, World C, on out to whatever nomenclature you have to use, because eventually it becomes infinite if you look at all the small possibilities. For example, the coin flip that falls heads in one world and tails in another is a difference between those two worlds, and so you have to account for it. Now, whether that is a substantial change on the outcome depends upon what the coin is being flipped for. Is the coin being flipped just by someone who's randomly flipping a coin while they're doing something else and is not recording the results or making a decision? Is it a coin flip at the start of a sporting event, which may have changed that sporting event? So it has a small impact, perhaps by whichever team wins the coin flip initially. Or is it a big coin flip scenario where it's the idea that something substantial was tied to that coin flip? And so the idea of the many worlds, the multiverse, though, is tied in the concept of that every deviation, every what if, almost immediately leads to either a parallel or nearby what if that could have happened. And so understanding that when we explore alternate history, we're not exploring every alternative that exists out there. We're exploring only the alternatives that might be of interest to us, or the alternatives that have some sense of plausibility, or the alternatives that make a difference. As I mentioned before, sort of going back to my idea of what I did on the day of September 11th versus what others did that day, if you go back to the idea of the multiverse, the many worlds, the simultaneous alternate realities that exist that are moving through and they're each changed by each small thing that could happen that makes them different and branches out, is that the world, or the two worlds that are only different by me leaving the house that morning, heading to the office 5 minutes apart, might be so inconsequentially different. They are so much the same that if you actually could somehow transport yourself between those two parallel universes, you may not even notice that it happened. Whereas, going back to the idea that I spoke about with the counterfactual of, if you change just one of these successful efforts by one of the teams of hijackers, so that you still even have the events of that day, but not the exact same events. In fact, we talked about that on the episode where we talked about what was the fate of the quote-unquote fourth plane that day. Even there, among those series of infinite worlds, that small change would be very noticeable, and I think probably in a big way. Certainly in the near-term time of what's there. Now, what we often argue for here on the podcast, and I think is true, that over a certain period of time, some of those near-term changes in the bigger scope and flow and sweep of history may not have been as consequential. And so it might be argued that the life or death, for example, of one soldier in a particular battle where tens of thousands of soldiers live or die is not significant in the overall flow of the course of that military history for that war, for that campaign. However, it could be significant based upon who that individual was and what they did or didn't do after the fact. You know, the old time travel conundrum of what would happen if you can go back and kill your grandfather. If it's your grandfather that died in World War II before your parents are conceived and before you're conceived, Yes, that's one soldier in the midst of a war that cost the lives of millions. It probably is inconsequential for the most part to the overall flow of the history that we know as World War II. It's incredibly consequential to the flow of the overall history that you know as you, because that did change your history. Enough of those combined, obviously, can also have an impact. And so to me, that's the interesting thing and part of the reason that we do the podcast and part of what I'm drawn to in the idea of both counterfactuals and alternate history is I look at them from both perspectives. I think it's a valuable thing to understand using the alternate history as the concept to understand the significance of the real historical event. You realize how significant or perhaps insignificant that was. That's much more like the exploration of a counterfactual. But there's also the fun conjecture of could one small thing, from the famous poem, for the want of a horseshoe nail, could the entire outcome of the kingdom have been different? So it works in both ways, the macro picture and the micro picture for me. And that's why I'm drawn to alternate history. Plus, it just makes an interesting setting for a fictional background. I guess that's the last thing that I want to close on is why do we actually find alternate history being so popular in terms of, particularly it certainly has been for the last multiple decades. If you go back, there's been writing on alt history for centuries in different ways, or shapes, or formats. It's not a new thing. But why is it so popular? I would argue the reason that it's so popular is it allows us to explore alternatives, but explore them in a familiar context. So, for example, I'm thinking just here most recently about the Philip K. Dick short story that was converted into a miniseries, The Man in the High Castle, where we have the situation where the United States loses World War II and is occupied by German and Japanese forces, and what that looks like. The story is told in a backdrop of an occupied America, which of course never happened. That's an alternate history. But one of the reasons it's so compelling as a fictional device is that we are familiar with the real timeline as readers, and so we're able to overlay things that are familiar to us, but look at them through an unfamiliar lens. So the question that exists is, what would it have looked like for the Western United States to be occupied by the Japanese Empire? We're able to think about that in unique ways, about what that means, looking at both who and what America is, also who and what Japan is, in that context, because we're able to do it through something that is familiar and yet is unfamiliar at the same time. So we're familiar with what it did look like, for example, for the German Reich to occupy parts of Europe for a period of time. Now we have that familiar backdrop that we can lay an American occupation against. And so we're able to draw similarities and contrasts because we're able to tie something that is new or different, the fictional occupation, but we're able to lay it against something that we have a historical understanding of. So the benefit for the author, and I think why so many good writers are drawn to using alternate history as a genre, is it allows them to use the familiar in a way that is not just a non-fictional telling of things. They're able to use the familiar, but they're able to use it in the genre of fiction to make the point that they want to without having to create an entire fictional world. The other thing that jumps to mind for me, there's even an extension of this. Most people are very familiar with George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, both the novels as well as the HBO television series. One of the interesting things there is if you are a student of history, you will discover time and time and time again that Martin is telling a very compelling story. I would argue better in the books in some ways than he told in the television series, and certainly we don't know the end of the books, but we know the end of the television series, which many found disappointing. But he is constantly borrowing and stealing from familiar elements that are inside of English history. The War of the Roses, for example, the idea of a wall tied back to Hadrian's Wall, even though the wall that exists in Westeros in the Game of Thrones world is very different. And so you see even a slightly different variation of the same thing that I'm talking about in an alternate historical fiction, in where, in Martin's case, he is taking familiar themes and using them to tell his fictional story. So what's actually happening for a writer of alternate history is he's taking a familiar scenario, a familiar backdrop, and is able to tell a fictional story inside of that. And I think that's why the genre is so compelling. And that's why I think while historians may enjoy their counterfactuals, a number of us that read and think about and watch movies and watch other media and have podcasts that focus on the alternate history is because we're fascinated by the idea of what the exploration of alternate history, going beyond the simple negation of a fact, the counterfactual, allows us to do, and the places that it allows our mind to roam. So I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Again, a little bit different. There's no what if. We're not going to talk about what if there was no counterfactual, although I guess if there was no counterfactual, we wouldn't be thinking about counterfactuals. But I just want to spend an episode just talking about sometimes you will hear folks refer to alternate history and counterfactuals being the same thing or them being different. And so I thought it'd be a good topic for us to explore. I've had that conversation actually with a number of people when I start talking about the podcast in my real life who will make that distinction or ask that question. So I thought it was worthy of at least an episode here. So I appreciate you allowing me to explore that, and I hope I did it justice. If I didn't, that's when I'm going to encourage you to go to our website. That's www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. There's a place for you to leave feedback there. And so if you liked something that you heard today, there's a place to do that. Or if you actually have a different take on alternate history versus counterfactuals, that's the place to go and leave that, and we would certainly welcome that. We welcome all the feedback there. We'd invite you to visit the website. That's an easy place to go back and see our entire back catalog of shows, find out more about the podcast, suggest topics to it. It's all kinds of ways that you can interact with us. Again, that's at www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. We'd encourage you, if you enjoy the podcast, you can, from there at the website or just in general, get links to our various social media, sharing on Facebook, Twitter, the other places that you can let the word get around about who we are and the fact that we're out there. We'd appreciate that. Always looking to expand our listener audience, sort of the family and community that we've built here on A Fork in Time. Of course, the other thing you can do at the website is have access to our Patreon link, which will let you go over, and if you choose to and are capable of doing so, provide some financial support for the podcast. Easy to do there for a very small amount, either pledged one time on a monthly basis. Helps to defray the cost and helps us to make it easier to continue to offer the podcast to you. Most of all, though, as we always do, we want to thank you for your time. That's the greatest gift that you can give us, and the best support that you can support that you can give us is by giving us a little bit of your time, and we're very appreciative of that. So this is Don signing off for this episode of A Fork in Time, and I'll borrow again what Alexis always signs off with, a bard from a famous other analogy by baseball great Yogi Berra. And our version of that simply says, if you encounter a fork in time, take it. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. Join us next time.